Hello, and welcome to Astronomy 100. In this segment, we're going to complete our discussion of the moon, and in particular, we're going to concentrate our efforts on understanding the phases of the moon. Now, when you go outside and you look at the moon, whether it's during the daytime or at night, one of the things that people recognize right away is that the moon seems to look a little bit different each day. The amount of the moon that is showing changes each day, and of course the brightness of the moon related to that changes. The other thing is that what time you see the moon during the day or night changes as well. And in a previous segment, if you recall, part of it is related to how the moon orbits around the Earth is going to determine when we see the moon in the sky, and of course how long it's out and when it rises and when it sets. So in this segment, we're going to concentrate on the changing appearance of the moon. And if you remember in our pictures here that we've seen in previous segments, over the course of about 29.5 days, the moon is going to change the way that it appears over time. And we call this lunar phasing, or the lunar phase cycle. In this video, or this animation I should say, what you're noticing is that the moon is changing the illumination over a period of time, and we've talked about some of the other terms that go with this. And you'll notice that as the moon changes its appearance over time, sometimes we only see a little tiny piece of it lit, sometimes we see maybe half of it lit, other times we might see all of it lit. And this is again what we call the phase of the moon. Now, the moon changes its appearance over time, but one of the confusions that people tend to have is they think that somehow this involves a shadow, that there's some sort of a shadow being cast onto the surface of the moon. And it does kind of look that way. But in reality, there is no shadow involved. What you're actually seeing is how much of the surface of the moon that is being lit by the sun. Of course, it's sunlight that lights up the surface of the moon, but how much of that portion of the moon that is lit that we get to see over a period of time. So there is no shadow, but there is a continual change in the orientation between the angle of the Earth relative to the sun, relative to the moon. Let me get this point across by switching to a different picture here. This is the top-down view. So if this is the Earth, right where the tip of the finger is right there would be the North Pole of the Earth. And this would be the equator of the Earth. And this is the orbit of the moon as the moon slowly makes its way around the Earth in its monthly journey, if you will. The sun is way off to the right, and sunlight is coming in from right to left. Now, the indications down here show you what's going on. What we have is the white portion is the side of the moon that is being currently lit by the sun. And notice how it is the side that is always facing the sun that is being lit. So there's one side of the moon that is always receiving sunlight. The green slashes refer to the side of the moon that is permanently facing away from the Earth. If you remember in the last segment, we talked about how the synchronous rotation of the moon keeps one side of the moon permanently facing away from us and one side permanently facing us. So the green slashes indicate what they're going to call the far side of the moon. Notice though, as the numbers change, 1 through 8 here, what is translated up at the top is what you see in the sky. So number 1's position would show you the appearance of this, number 1 here. Number 2's position shows you the appearance of this as well. Notice as the moon makes its orbit around the Earth, what's happening is the way that we see the moon from the Earth slowly changes. So for instance, in this first position here, the side of the moon that is facing the Earth is also the side that is not receiving any sunlight. It's the opposite side of the moon that's being lit. So from the Earth's perspective, there's nothing to see. It is the backside of the moon that is being lit. By the time the moon moves to this position here, this is the half that is always facing us. But notice that a small portion of the side that faces us is now being lit. And so even though half of the moon is being lit, it's only a little tiny piece of it that we get to see from our perspective. And so what we end up seeing is this shape right here. When the moon makes it to this position here, the side that is facing us is now half of the side receiving sunlight. So it looks like the moon is lit by half. In this position here, what you'll notice is that the majority of the side that faces us is also being lit by the sun. A little tiny piece of it is not able to be seen, but the majority of the side that the sunlight is reaching is able to be seen by us, and so you'll notice that it looks like it's almost entirely illuminated. By the time the moon makes it here, we see the entire half that is being lit by the sun, so it looks like this. And then on this position to this position and this position, it simply is the reverse. It starts to back down to half and then just a small crescent, and then if it were to start all over again, it would go back to the position 1. So what you actually can tell by this diagram is that it's not a shadow, but it's how much of the side of the moon that is lit is able to be seen by the people of the Earth will determine how we see it in the sky. What we need, though, is some terminology. You'll notice that the changing appearance of the moon over time requires some names that we can refer to. It's not easy to always say half versus most versus not quite half, so we need terms that are a little bit more technically accurate to describe what you're seeing. So astronomers have developed a little bit of a language or terminology that goes with the phases of the moon, and let's have a look at that. Now, what you'll notice on the screen is the change in the appearance of the moon over time. And so there are names to go with each of these shapes that you see here. Let's walk through those names. The first one here on the upper left, this is what we call a crescent moon. The shape is simply a crescent shape, and you'll notice the illumination is less than half. Anything less than half is called a crescent moon. It can be on the right side or it could be illuminated on the left side. It makes no difference, it's still a crescent moon. You'll notice the next one over here, this is what we call a quarter moon. A quarter moon is when it's lit by half. Now I realize that's a little confusing. Half of the moon is lit, but we call it quarter, and we'll come back to explaining why that is in just a minute. When more than half of the moon is illuminated, but not quite all of it, we call this gibbous. So a gibbous moon is not quite completely full, but more than half, or more than quarter to be more technically accurate. Down here in the lower left, of course, is the familiar full moon, and then the one in the middle here, this is what we call a new moon. Now, one caution about a new moon, notice that during a new moon, we can't see any of it lit. It's because the sunlight is reaching the back side of the moon or the other side. But don't be confused. If you go outside and you look around the sky and you don't notice the moon anywhere, that doesn't mean it's a new moon. It could be that the moon just hasn't risen yet or it's not in the sky. It'll be out later on. So new moon is not really no moon. Don't make the confusion. A new moon is when the moon is actually in the sky, but we can't see it because it's being illuminated on the other side. So these are the shapes. Now, one of the problems we have is that you'll notice that the illumination can be one side or the other. And so what we need is the ability to describe when the shape is growing over time, as you see here, going from a crescent to full, or shrinking over time. So that's where we invoke the two words. The first word that goes with this is the word waxing. And waxing is just an old English word that is the equivalent of growing. So a waxing moon is a growing shaped, a growing nature to its shape. And then waning is the word that means shrinking. So a waning moon is when the shape is shrinking over time. So the moon waxes and then it wanes. It grows and then it shrinks. These two terms, however, are only applicable to a crescent moon and a gibbous moon, because only a crescent moon can grow and shrink. Gibbous moon can grow and shrink. A quarter is either perfectly a quarter or it's not. Full is either full or it's not. So you can only have waxing and waning crescents and waxing and waning gibbous moons. So let's go back to a picture like this, slightly different than the one we saw a few minutes ago. This one now is using the terminology that we just learned. The difference is that there are letters instead of numbers, but it works the same way. We're looking down on the north pole of the Earth, as you see indicated down here, sunlight coming from the right. Notice the new moon phase, and then we have waxing crescent all the way to first quarter, and then we have waxing gibbous all the way to full, and then we have waning gibbous all the way to third, and then we have waning crescent all the way back to new. So the illumination grows over time, and then the illumination shrinks over time. The moon waxes, and then it wanes. And so each of the names now is in place. So let's go back to why the letter C in this case and the letter G in this case, let's go back to why they're not called half moon. They're called quarter moons because in reality, we are only seeing half of the illuminated half of the moon. And half of a half is a quarter. So half of the illuminated half is a quarter moon. And the reason why it's called first quarter is because this is the first instance that you're going to see a quarter moon, hence the first quarter moon. And then by the time the moon makes its way all the way around here, it is the third quarter moon because it has gone 3/4 of its way around the Earth. So you can think of it as 3/4 of its way through the phase cycle. So first quarter moon and third quarter moon. It is also, by the way, appropriate to refer to the third quarter moon as the last quarter. So first quarter and last quarter are also just fine. Now, there's one thing that needs to be fixed, and what I want to show you is that you'll notice that when it's a new moon all the way to first quarter, what we end up having is an entire span of time right here that is all waxing crescent. So if the moon were right here, it's a waxing crescent. If the moon is right here, it's a waxing crescent. If the moon is right here, it's also a waxing crescent. So the problem is that if I were to tell you that it's a waxing crescent moon tonight, you would go outside, but knowing where it is in its orbit is vague. It could be anywhere in this stretch of the moon's orbit. So the way that we solve that is we refer to how many days old the moon is. You will hear an astronomer say, the moon today is 5 days old, or the moon today is 22.7 days old. And what that's referring to is we define a new moon as the beginning of the lunar phase cycle. So the beginning of every phase cycle begins with the new moon, and we call that 0 days old. The very beginning is 0 days. And so it's going to take a few days to get up to the quarter phase here. The first quarter moon takes about 7.5 days or thereabouts to get there. So if I say the moon is a 5-day-old moon, the moon is somewhere right about here. If I say the moon is a 1-day-old moon, it's somewhere right about here. If I say the moon is 7.5 days old, well then it's a first quarter moon. So that way we can be very specific about its phase as well as where it is in its orbit around the Earth, or where it is in its lunar phase cycle. If I were to say the moon is 17 days old, well, it takes about 15 days to get to a full moon, so 16 days, 17 days puts it right here at about where waning gibbous is. So you'll notice that every single day, if you were to look this up, it will indicate to you what the phase of the moon is, and it will also tell you how many days old the moon is. The entire lunar phase cycle is 29.5 days, so approximately 30, so 29.5 days. And so anywhere in between, you will find reference to how many days old the moon is, and it's always a number that's between 0 and 29.5. So the lunar phase cycle is something that can be understood if you think of it as it's simply how the light from the sun reflects off of the moon and how much of the moon we're capable of seeing from the perspective of the Earth. And of course, what you'll notice is that we obviously have names for the phases, and we have also names for how it is growing and shrinking over time. Now, put all of this together, and we now have, of course, a complete understanding of the phases of the moon. And what I encourage you to do is to go outside from time to time, look at the moon in the sky, notice what time of day it is, and see if you can figure out the appropriate name for the phase of the moon. If the moon is out early in the evening, well, then we know it's a waxing moon, growing as it goes over time. If the moon is out late at night, then it's typically a waning moon that is shrinking over time. And if you see the moon early in the morning, it's typically also a waning moon, maybe a waning crescent. So put all these things together and match it with what you see in the sky, and you can start to understand this entire process. So we now have finished all of the information about the moon. We've learned lots of things about its surface features, its formation. We've talked about all of the things related to how you see the moon move through the sky, and then finally lunar phases. So I hope you have learned something in this section, and we'll move on from here. Thanks for joining us.